Hello, viewers of OBN Horn of Africa. This is our special edition, and today I'm joining PD Lawton from UK, and PD Lawton is becoming our almost permanent analyst. And today we are gonna discuss on the presidential action. President Donald J. Trump issued several executive orders and directives on his first day back to office. And thank you, PD, for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back with OBN.
What is an executive order in your opinion, and when and why is it signed, PD?
Well, it's a customary procedure when a new government comes into power, and an executive order is the stage before making something into law, turning it into law. So they're executing a new legal term or legal process. It's nothing to worry about. It happens all the time. I suspect that people who are anti-Trump, as there are many people in the world who are in the West who are anti-Trump, is that they are trying to make it seem he is authoritarian. So there's nothing unusual about a president and a new government signing executive orders.
Let's see the impact of these executive orders that were already signed by the president, and what should Africa do to cope up with, very harmful executive orders, which includes, of course, suspension of foreign assistance programs and external revenue service, and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and others, of course. How do you see the impact of these already signed executive orders?
So we look at what President Trump is trying to do, and we don't really know as yet. He's only just got in. I suspect he's doing a U-turn, everything his predecessor put in place. And I think the best way to view Trump's presidency is to understand it from the point of view that we have been living in the West under an extreme left political system. Trump is coming in and people view him as far right. But we have had a strange, unrealistic view of politics. In politics, you have right, you have left, and you have center. And there's a saying, I think it's a Confucian saying, that the man who goes too far east ends up west. And what has happened is that the left in politics, and they are both in politics and in academia, have gone so far left that they have ended up, sectors of it have ended up looking remarkably like fascism. So we cannot view things through our current prism, and we can't look at Trump and judge Trump through our current prism, because the current prism has been distorted, and everything in the West, in politics and academia, has been so far left that it has actually been the far right. So it's a very interesting time in the world. Myself, I feel hopeful. I think it's an historic moment that Trump has gotten in his second term in office. It is worrying when countries cut their aid and they cut many of the programs that are supposed to drive trade with African countries. It's very, very worrying, and a lot of this has been happening. So really, I think we're going to have to rethink. We're going to have to rethink a lot of what has been going on and assess how beneficial was it. This is going to be a difficult time, but it's also an opportunity to create new systems.
Considering that the U.S. is the largest foreign aid donor, and Africa receives a substantial portion of this aid, what are the potential long-term implications PD?
Part of what Trump is doing is almost an isolationist policy for America. So number one, bear in mind that the Western countries who are still under, apart from Trump at the moment, as far as we can see, this almost radical left politics, Trump is reversing that. The system that's been in place is still in place, has almost been cannibalizing the Western countries. So you have Europe, Britain, and America. Their economies are being cannibalized. They're being cannibalized in many different ways, primarily through energy, the cost of electricity, and of destroying the energy generation systems. They're being cannibalized in other ways. So we've got a situation where Trump is trying to reverse that. Now, it isn't, in my opinion, a good idea to cut foreign assistance to African countries who depend upon it, because African economies have been under an extremely Malthusian foreign policy from the West. When I talk about the West, I talk about the West in terms of what we are governed by, and what we are governed by is not a healthy system. It hasn't been a healthy system for a very, very long time. It would be far better if Trump went back to the policies of John F. Kennedy. You know, John F. Kennedy had a tremendously healthy relationship with many of the African leaders at the time. You know, in the 60s, he was a great friend of Kwame Nkrumah, for instance. And they had these fantastic ideas and fantastic dreams of how to turn Africa into the continent that it is surely to become. So I think Trump is making a mistake there. Obviously, it's going to damage a lot of countries. It's going to damage people on the ground. I know that 2 years ago, the British government cut the aid to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, by 50%. Absolutely shocking. So when they do this, there should be in place some kind of legal term that they are not allowed to do it without making remedial measures. There has to be a give and take. So I think we are, as I said, in for some very extreme changes, and it will be a case of African countries will be turning more and more to the Eastern Bloc, to China and Russia, for assistance and development, which they are already doing. So Trump, in a way, is driving African countries more towards the East. So we'll see what happens in the future.
Can you explain the potential impact of the External Revenue Service plan, which imposes, tariffs and taxes on importers, and how might these specifically affect the African exporters to the U.S. and undermine, the African Growth and Opportunity Act?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time AGOA has been attacked, would it? But, I don't know quite what's happening with this. Trump is apparently making a secondary revenue collecting system. Quite why he's doing it is very, very interesting. It is possibly some kind of move against the Federal Reserve Bank. The American economy is struggling. It's really struggling, incredibly in debt. And very, very little has been plowed into it over the last few years. So whether or not Trump is trying to do something to bypass the Federal Reserve, I don't know. That's just a wild guess of mine. In terms of trade, in terms of acts like AGOA, I don't think that is really in the spirit of a multipolar world. So really, this is something that Trump is missing out on. The idea that we are now looking at the BRICS economy, the economy of the BRICS nations. The many more countries are joining. Ethiopia, of course, is one of them, and most recently Nigeria has joined. So this whole BRICS movement is a far more healthy system It's a far more equitable system, and it is not based on a unipolar world, a unipolar power, which is what America has been for so long, and of course Britain before then. So in the spirit of a multipolar world, it's certainly these decisions of Trump, but he is obviously doing it for a reason. And quite why, we'll just have to wait and see. You know, before Trump, his first term in office, he did actually do a lot of good. He stopped a lot of the wars. He pulled a lot of American troops out of African countries. I think of Somalia, certainly as one. And the war in the Eastern Congo really died down for a time while Trump was president. So I do believe that he has a genuine desire to stop all these wars that the West seems so good at igniting across the world. So let's just think on the optimistic and think on the positive, and we must just hope that we're not going to be back in a situation where we have the West countering anything the BRICS nations are trying to do, because the BRICS is a tremendously positive thing in our world at the moment, tremendously positive. And it really is the epitome of a multipolar world, as opposed to this system, the top-down system, imperial system, really, that Africa has been subjected to for such a long time.
The other thing is the decision of withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and how do you see the consequences of this action, presidential action, and in terms of, especially in terms of, the global climate efforts?
Yes, well, I want to applaud. I'm tremendously pleased that Trump is withdrawing from this agreement, because I don't think that it was anything positive. It didn't have anything positive. It doesn't have anything positive to offer African countries. You know, there are two ways of looking at climate change. And yes, there is climate change. Wet countries are getting wetter, hot countries are getting hotter. But this is not driven by production of carbon dioxide. The whole science of climate change is flawed. Carbon dioxide is a plant food. It is not a pollutant. The pollutant is the sulfuric acid from when you burn coal. But we have a solution to that. It's called Hele coal. So you can burn coal and you can burn it so it is almost 100% clean if you use the Hele, H-E-L-E, system. So we have answers and we have solutions to many of our pollution problems. I mean, there's a pollution crisis in the world. There really is. You know, the seas are full of plastic. Waters are contaminated. The air is dirty. There really are tremendous pollution problems. But by attacking energy and pushing the world towards using only renewable energy is not going to solve that problem. And what the West has been doing is it's been dictating energy policies to Africa. And these energy policies, number one, aren't going to work in Africa because the geography is different. And it is going to reduce the generation of electricity. We can come to the example of South Africa just to explain that. What the West has done and what these energy policies have done are trying to limit industrial capacity. Most of the African continent is in desperate need of energy, which is why Ethiopia so magnificently built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Such a tremendous project, absolutely brilliant. And as we can see, Ethiopia is already selling energy that it produces from GERD to its neighboring countries. This is a solution. That's hydro. But hydro in many of the southern African countries is not a viable option. It really isn't, because there is not sufficient rainfall for it to be a 100% secure form of producing electricity. So I'm a great proponent of nuclear. And I think that many of the African countries who are looking at nuclear can, if they adopt it and if they can find the finance to have it built, can really transcend an economic status quo, because energy is the backbone of any economy. You know, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to appreciate the fact that in order to run an industrialized economy, you have to have the cheapest, most reliable form of electricity, like you have with the GERD. And you run all the industrial parks, the special economic zones. Everything depends on the generation of power. You know, if you have 100% access to electricity among the population, you increase people's students' abilities to study so that you have far better education results. The impact on farming is tremendous because you can refrigerate your goods. You can do absolutely everything that you need to do in terms of manufacturing if you have this reliable source of energy. So the green agenda, which Trump has pulled out of, the Green New Deal, I think is a very, very good move. And I think a lot of African countries will be applauding, because the West has been saying to them, oh no, you can't burn your oil, you can't burn your coal, because it's not in the remit of the green energy policies. Well, that is most incredibly unfair. And how on earth how can these Eurocentric energy policies be inflicted on Africa? It simply isn't fair. So if we look at the case of South Africa, and bear in mind, excuse me, bear in mind that 80% of South Africa's energy comes from coal. South Africa is between South Africa and Nigeria. South Africa is the most industrialized economy on the continent. And why is that? It's because they can produce electricity through coal and through Koeberg, the nuclear power plant. So in recent years, South Africa has undergone an electricity crisis with their parastatal Eskom, the power producer. And what has happened is that their industrial capacity has been undermined through deliberate policies to inflict Eurocentric green energy policies on a country where it isn't going to work. So I think we can be joyful that Trump has had the temerity to do this and to return some kind of sanity to America's energy crisis. You know, the European countries almost all have an energy crisis. Germany is on its knees because they decommissioned all their nuclear power plants, and now they're getting the power from France, which is nuclear. That's in problems because France is being kicked out of Africa, and that's where they get the uranium from, Niger. So it's a mess. It's a huge mess. Now, African economies aren't going to solve their multiple problems of needing foreign assistance and development aid by following these green energy policies, or these COP meetings that say, oh, you know, the world is going to boil over if we don't all stop producing carbon dioxide and run everything on solar-powered energy and wind farms. It's not going to happen. You don't go backwards, you go forwards. And the most innovative technology is the South African invention of the small modular reactor. It's a remarkable invention being produced in South Africa. And if African countries were to adopt that, where they haven't got access to hydro or other means, then it would certainly be a fantastic solution to an energy crisis. So rather than inflicting backward energy policies, which are really Malthusian energy policies, let's see the West help to finance African economies, driving up energy production. You know, one last thing on that. This whole debate on climate change, you can view it in two ways. You can view it in the way that the West are doing it, and you can view it in the way that China are doing it. And what China is doing is really enhancing the environment. They have done some very, very interesting things in terms of climate mitigation. You see, you can increase rainfall in a region by planting trees. And that helps to form, the trees give off carbon dioxide, and this helps to form cloud cover. So we can change our environment by doing things like that. I know that China have reclaimed tens of thousands of hectares of desert through very, very innovative environmental programs, by protecting the soils, keeping the nutrients and the water in the soils.
And by the way, Ethiopia has been doing a tremendous job in terms of planting trees. We do have a green legacy initiative here in
Yes.
Ethiopia since the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took office. And I think Ethiopia is an exemplary, at least in Africa.
Ethiopia is a shining example because of the policies you're implementing and your Green Legacy Initiative. Exactly, it is. And, you know, we can look at that whole climate debate in terms of something which is really almost destructive on the human being. Or we can do it as, no, we are rebuilding our environment, which has been damaged by poverty, by war, by so many other things. And we can rebuild it, and we can treat it with the respect it deserves. And I think what Ethiopia is doing is such a perfect example. And you've done that for yourselves. You've done it for your own nation, for your own people, for your heritage. Not because it's a UN policy. And I think that's the important thing to note, that we do it for ourselves, not because it's a UN policy inflicted on a country.
Trump also, announced a suspension of refugee resettlement to the U.S. And how do you think this will affect the developing countries, including Ethiopia and others, of course?
Yeah, it's a problem, isn't it? It's, you have to look at it in two ways. On one hand, you have a very necessary move made on the part of President Trump. And we have the same problem in the UK. Europe suffers from the same problem that America does, because there's been an open border policy, and vast numbers of migrants have been coming to Western countries, many of whom are undocumented, many of whom are part of criminal gangs. When you say this to people, people react and call you far right. You're not being far right. Any country has to have a fundamental security system in place where they secure their borders and they know exactly who is coming in and out of their country. It's very important, especially in this day and age. So Trump is addressing that. I don't know if he's going to go over the top. And I know that so many people from Africa are keeping families alive, are supporting their families by working in Western countries. It's a very important part of the system. Let's hope that in the future that it isn't necessary, that every person born in an African country can find productive employment, can find a brilliant and prosperous future by staying at home in their country and not needing to go to elsewhere in the world. I think that it's a retrogressive step in terms of destroying ties rather than building them. It's so important that we build ties, but many of the actions that Trump is doing at the moment are remedial. So he is having to adjust because of a system that's been in place that has been extremely destructive and negative for the American people. So we have to bear that in mind.
Finally, in your opinion, how do you see these measures by the US President Donald Trump, and how do you think it limits its global influences? Because they are, a bit becoming conservative than it is previous nature.
Well, America has so much to make up for in terms of the eyes of the world, so it has been subjected to such a terrible image. I think the previous administration is the most destructive, most criminal administration in the history of the United States. There have been so many regime changes, so many foreign instigated wars, as you in Ethiopia know only too well with your very recent history. And we know, because there's provable documentation, that your so-called civil war was instigated from the West. Now, it isn't just Ethiopia. This is happening in many places across the continent. So the West has to have a sea change policy towards Africa. That isn't going to happen anytime soon. It really isn't. The French are pulling out of West Africa in terms of their troops. It doesn't mean that the French are going to leave West Africa alone. They just do it in other ways. And I think it might have been something that I've already mentioned, but the case of social media and the media. This is our next battleground. All the more important to have institutions like OBN. Because what is happening is governments are being toppled through social media platforms and through representing anti-government forces as something positive. So we really have to look at the next battleground, which is the battleground of the media.
P.D. Lawton from UK, an author, Pan-Africanist. Thank you very much for your insights, wonderful insights, and for your time. You come solely to OBN whenever we want you, and thank you very much for that.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Dear viewers of OBN Horn of Africa, this is all about our discussion with P.D. Lawton from UK, and I'm sure you have got some insights from this discussion, and till next edition, goodbye.